Hello, and welcome to this Parkinson's webinar brought to you by Cure Parkinson's, the Journal of Parkinson's Disease, and the University of Edinburgh. I'm Professor Tilo Kunath at the Centre for Regenerative Medicine here in Edinburgh, Scotland, and I'm pleased to be chairing today's session. So today we're going to be focusing on pesticides and Parkinson's. While genetics plays a major role in Parkinson's, we know that environmental factors are a massive piece of the puzzle. Exposure to specific chemicals have been directly associated with increased risk of Parkinson's, and that's what we'll be discussing today. I'm delighted to be joined by an excellent panel who will be introducing themselves in a moment. We'll start with a set of pre-prepared questions for the first part, and then for the second half, we'll be addressing questions from you. So please use the Q&A box to post questions as we're going along. We won't be able to address individual clinical queries, but we'll do our best to cover the broader issues during the discussion. So let's begin with Mark, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Mark van Grieken, and I've lived in Scotland now 46 years, because you may know take it from the name that I'm Dutch originally. I was diagnosed with Parkinson's some 20 years ago and had a very similar response as many others who diagnosed, denial and so forth. In the last 6-7 years, however, I've become much more involved in research. I became a member and fellow of European Patient Academy for Therapeutic Innovation, who runs training courses for people to be involved in patient participation programs, etc. I'm particularly interested in the potential relationship between pesticides and Parkinson, because I have some personal questions related to this, having grown up right in the center of the bulb industry in the Netherlands. So I look forward to talking a bit more later.
Great. Thank you, Mark. And Sarah, please.
Hi, I'm Sarah Marzi, and I'm a senior lecturer in neuroscience at King's College London, and I also lead a research group within the UK Dementia Research Institute. And my lab is really interested in gene regulation in a process called epigenetics. So that's basically how cells switch on and off genes. And we're interested in how this is altered in response to environmental risk factors in different neurodegenerative diseases, but particularly also in the context of Parkinson's and in the context of pesticides, to understand how these exposures change the cells in our brain and ultimately predispose us to Parkinson's disease.
Brilliant. Thank you. And last but not least, Brianna, please.
Hi, everyone. I am Brianna De Miranda. I am an associate professor of neurology at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. I run a basic science research lab focused on understanding the cellular mechanisms that drive Parkinson's-related neurodegeneration, specifically from environmental exposures. So I am a toxicologist by training, but I have spent my career studying Parkinson's disease because of this link between environmental exposures and Parkinson's neurodegeneration. And so I use in vitro and in vivo models in my research lab here at the university to try to understand these mechanisms that are driving neurotoxicity related specifically to Parkinson's disease.
Great. Thanks, everyone. So let's stick with you, Brianna. I'm going to ask you a three-part question. So first, we'll start with the basics. So what exactly are pesticides? What are the primary types? What's the best evidence that supports the relationship between pesticides and Parkinson's? And are some pesticides more associated with Parkinson's, like paraquat or rotenone, than other pesticides? So take it away.
Sure. So to answer the first part of your question, a pesticide is just an umbrella term for any chemical that is intention is to kill off an unwanted species. And so, for example, an herbicide is specific to kill off a weed or a plant that we don't want growing. An insecticide is exactly as it sounds. It's to kill off insects that might eat our crops. And of course, there are other categories as well, like pesticide for unwanted fish. And this goes all the way down into fungicides and things that really are supposed to target what we don't want growing. And pesticides in general are, have been made for use in our agriculture or in other human developed areas so that we can at times feed a lot of people. So they can be very useful, but they can also be very dangerous because their intention is to actually kill a living species of some type. So where we run into trouble is that they can often be toxic to humans as well. So the best evidence that supports this relationship between pesticide exposure and Parkinson's really comes from a number of epidemiological studies that have been conducted over the last 30 to 40 years. These started really gaining speed in the 1980s, mostly in the United States, showing that pesticide applicators or people who lived in areas with really heavy pesticide use had increased odds ratios, so statistically increased risk for developing Parkinson's disease from being in the areas where these pesticides were used or if they were applying them. And there are, in fact, some pesticides that sort of rose to the top as being really specifically linked to Parkinson's risk. For example, you mentioned paraquat. That's actually one of the pesticides that we have the most amassed data on. That actually some of the very first pesticide studies were on paraquat. So we have many decades of evidence that link paraquat, which is actually an herbicide, to Parkinson's risk. But of course, there are many others that have shown up in these studies, like rotenone, like other general herbicides or pesticides that have been used. And so one just quick note to talk about is that sometimes pesticides are used in combination. A person may be exposed to more than one at one time. And so we have to study all of them and their interaction in order to understand that risk. It's a fairly complicated situation, but yes, certainly statistically increased risk with many pesticides in Parkinson's disease.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's quite compelling. The evidence is coming from as early as the 1980s. Mark, what's your personal story? I know you have a personal story about exposure to pesticide, and what's the evidence in the Netherlands for association with pesticides and Parkinson's?
Well, the Netherlands, as everyone knows, is partly below sea level. It's highly dependent on levels of water. And the reason for these very particular water levels was the reason that the bulb industry developed in a particular part of the Netherlands. It was on excavated dunes, basically, leaving a 55 centimeter height to the groundwater table, ideal for growing tulips and hyacinths and daffodils. If you now fast forward, then you may find that only last year, a lily farmer in the Netherlands in the polders was taken to court because the people across the water body to the field were frequently ill at other illnesses, but there was also suspicion of more deeper problems, such as Parkinson's. Now, I personally think that there is a very great likelihood, I would say, that my own Parkinson's may have been triggered or even caused by pesticides. Because I'm of an age that I still learn to swim in the canals, and I worked in the bulb industry during summer holidays. I can still smell the pesticides. I was eating them through my lunch biscuits, etc. And increasingly in the Netherlands, people come forward with examples of direct or indirect suspicion that they're exposed to pesticides may be the cause or the trigger of their Parkinson's. Now, of course, there's a lot of research become about this, particularly aimed at trying to get the industry to have to prove that they're safe rather than we have to prove that they're not safe. And there's an interesting paper, which is this more discussion paper, a personal view ultimately, about environmental toxicants and Parkinson's disease, recent risk. And it says, and I just one little sentence, this showed that TCE inhalation is far more potent than ingestion for causing dopamine energetic neurodegeneration and motor impairments in rodents. Now, you could say, and in me, instead of rodents, because that's exactly what happened to me. I have neurodegenerative disease, and especially motor problems. Now, this is not evidence, but there is an increasing body of resistance to continuing permissions that have only recently been granted again to the EU for the licensing of glyphosate, And when the Dutch minister was asked about it on live television, his answer was, there's no evidence that these drugs are harmful. Would you use it in your own garden? No. I thought it was quite telling.
Yeah, that is very telling. He would not use it in his own garden. Brianna, I'm just going to come back to you briefly before Sarah. Mark mentioned inhalation versus ingestion. So how are people exposed to these pesticides, and is inhalation or ingestion better or worse? And why are we hearing all of this news about increasing incidence of Parkinson's worldwide when these chemicals are being used for the last 50 years, more or less?
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate Mark mentioning that the idea of inhalation being a particular risk for neurotoxicity is actually something that my lab studies. The study that you quoted in that article actually came from my lab. So I'm especially equipped to handle this question. And so what we found was that if rodents ingested a toxic substance, in this case, not a pesticide, a solvent called trichloroethylene or TCE, they were, of course, it produced toxic effects in the brain, but it required a much higher dose than if they inhaled the volatile component of that solvent. And the reason being that, when you ingest something, typically the liver metabolizes it before it gets to the brain. And when you inhale something, it often can get directly into the brain, as well as it's not quite as metabolized by the lungs before the lungs perfuse the blood, and then that goes into the brain. And so our research suggests that inhalation is a concern for neurotoxicity associated with Parkinson's. And so that's a route of exposure that we're very interested in. Not to forget about other routes, equally important, just something that we note about potency. So people are exposed in many different ways, environmentally, to many different substances, pesticides being one. I just mentioned organic solvents being another. Any industrial byproduct that can produce neurotoxicity, we worry about risk for Parkinson's disease. So including heavy metals and air pollution have been studied. And one of the reasons why it might be increasing in risk or increasing in concern is simply because as the world industrializes, more people are exposed to these industrial byproducts that we know have linked to neurotoxic effects. And so part of that incidence increase may have to do with countries around the globe that have recently industrialized and are now using these substances more commonly. In addition, people tend to be living longer, and so we may see less mortality from other concerns, and therefore people are living long enough to develop Parkinson's from these chemicals. Although, just as a brief note, I will mention that the rate of Parkinson's disease is outpacing the rate of aging, and so we know that it's not simply that people are living longer. We know that this is a direct result of exposure across the lifespan that's ultimately increasing or impacting disease risk.
Yeah, that's a really key point to finish on, that the rate of Parkinson's increase is outpacing the rate of aging. So it's not just aging. But also, having said that, not everyone who lives near a paraquat farm gets Parkinson's. So there's obviously a lot of other factors, including genetics. So Sarah, can you tell us about the complex interplay between genetic risk and exposure to these risk factors?
Yes, absolutely. So Parkinson's is what we would call a classic complex disease, meaning that both genetic and environmental factors can play a big role. There are a minority of people with Parkinson's that develop from a single known genetic cause, and those genes have told us quite a bit about the biology of what's happening in those subsets of Parkinson's. But for the majority of people that get Parkinson's, there's no smoking gun gene or one environmental exposure. There are lots of risk factors, and risk factors means that these things increase your likelihood of developing Parkinson's disease, but they're not necessarily deterministic. So just as you were saying, just because you might live near a farm and get some pesticide exposure, not everyone who gets that exposure will develop Parkinson's. It's a bit like with smoking and lung cancer, for example. Smoking increases your risk for lung cancer, but some people smoke a lot and never develop lung cancer. So why is that? Really, it's because we think that different environmental risk factors and exposures and our genetic background risk sort of add up cumulatively to increase our risk. And potentially that once you reach a certain threshold, that's when you might develop Parkinson's disease. But you might have a very protective genetic background, and then a single exposure won't put you above that threshold. So really, that makes it really complicated, because you have all these different genetic risk factors that increase your risk a little bit, and then you have different environmental risk factors. And as Brianna also indicated, you're rarely ever exposed to just one thing. It's many things acting together. And so I guess research that people like Brianna and myself do is really taking these individual risk factors and figuring out what they do, but also understanding, do they sort of pile on the same biological processes, basically? Do they do similar things and thereby add up vulnerability and damage to the neurons in our brain?
Yeah. Can we just stick with you for a moment? I wanted to ask a very specific biological question. So let's take paraquat as an example. How does paraquat, what does it do to a neuron in a cell? If you can explain it simply for our audience, what does it actually do to increase the risk of Parkinson's?
I think Brianna would be an even better person to answer this. So I'm going to take one generic answer, which is pesticides generally affect quite essential cellular processes, and that's how they kill the pest species, right? Say an insecticide. You need to kill that insect so it breaks something in their cells. The problem is when we as humans or other species get exposed to that, it damages our cells in similar way. One thing that is often affected is cellular metabolism and energy production in the cells, so the so-called mitochondria, and blocking energy production in the mitochondria. Paraquat, the example you mentioned, I think primarily generates reactive oxygen species. So these are basically molecules that cause damage to the DNA itself. But I think beyond that, it has multiple different effects and also downstream effects from the first generation. So either by damaging mitochondria or by generating reactive oxygen species, you then have lots of cascading effects in the cells that are directly affected and in the cells that they interact with, that in turn cause downstream symptoms. And so it's really important to try and understand all of those.
Yeah. Brianna, do you want to add to that? Maybe sticking with paraquat just as an example, simply, if you can explain simply.
Yes, no, Sarah did a really nice job answering that question. Paraquat is, the intention of paraquat is to stop the rapid development or growth of plants, right? And so it does that by affecting the electron transport chain in chloroplasts. We don't have chloroplasts in human cells, therefore what Sarah mentioned with this generation of reactive oxygen species, both in the cytoplasm and near the site of the mitochondria, which then causes a feed-forward cycle of reactive oxygen species that damage the cell, and this causes a lot of downstream effects. And so ultimately, it's this oxidative stress, we believe, that's driving the damage. And then as a sort of one step beyond that, just thinking about how dopamine neurons are considered selectively vulnerable to this type of reactive oxygen species and neurotoxicity. And that's why we believe the dopaminergic neurons of the substantia nigra tend to degenerate first in terms of their vulnerability to this type of oxidative damage.
Yeah. Mark, so you have mentioned you suspect pesticides have been involved in your Parkinson's. Can you think back what were your first signs of, and do you think it was really, what do you think pesticides was doing to your body?
That's tricky, of course. I know the exposure has been long and repetitive between my birth and probably until I was 18 and moved away from Lisse, where I grew up. Lisse, where I grew up, is one of the relative hotspots in terms of not just Parkinson, but other disease. There is a spatial variation study done, which does give does have some significant differences between different parts of the country, but not necessarily explaining any particular area. So there's notable differences, but they are not, as I understand it, scientifically significant at the moment. So my exposure was really being in a family and a family tradition of the bulb industry, and being on the bulb fields and touching bulbs, but particularly when I could earn money, which was, of course, it started when I was 11 and I got 1.11 guilders or something like that. It was handling bulbs on a one-to-one basis all the time. And that grew to me doing a job that's called hyacinth propagation, which is cutting out the root zone with a circular knife and then letting the bulb dry. And that can give 120 bulblets per bulb, so a huge increase in productivity. That was something that was extremely well paid. And I did it for 10 days, 10 hours a day, 6 or 7 weeks in the year. But hyacinths have dust which is very itchy, and they need to be dipped anyway in pesticides. So we were very pleased if they were just dipped before we handled them, one after another, 1,000, 2,000 bulbs a day. And of course, we could breathe in and I can still smell that, and we would have it on our hands. And so when I heard first about this potential relationship between pesticides and Parkinson, I thought back, and there is some tentative evidence perhaps, but nothing substantial enough. But for me, enough cause and reason to try and take this a lot further.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark. Thank you for sharing that. So I was going to ask now Sarah and Brianna about mechanisms observed from animal models. So what are animal models telling us? And is that evidence not enough to start advocating, which we will get to, and I can see questions already piling. But what do the animal models tell us about these pesticides?
The animal models are super critical in that we can have a controlled exposure. We can have basically a genetically identical set of animals and expose some of them to a pesticide and others not, and then really isolate what just that exposure is doing. And then we can study their brains. And in fact, it's been shown that some of these models, they really start to build up a lot of the biological manifestations of what you would see in Parkinson's. So for example, there's a protein alpha-synuclein that misfolds and aggregates in neurons in Parkinson's. This happens in some of these animal models, and the dopaminergic neurons start to die. And you see other cellular dysfunctions, and potentially also in the whole organism, you get some of the motor symptoms that you would get in human Parkinson's. And so I don't personally study the animals in my lab, but I collaborate with people like Brianna and others. And so then I get the brains and I study what's really happening individually in different brain cells, how they react, how they shift their programs to deal with these exposures in response to that. And that in turn can tell us a lot about this, what we were saying. It's not just the first mechanism, like blocking the mitochondria or these reactive oxygen species, but what sort of biological cascades does that set off. And so that's in fact something that Brianna and I are working together on.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in really quickly and add to Sarah's very nice answer. Just to give you kind of an idea of the impact that these animal models have on the Parkinson's research field, we can expose an animal to a certain toxicant. So, for example, the toxicant rotenone, which we mentioned earlier, or as we do in my lab, the organic solvent TCE. And we expose the whole animal to that. So in my lab, we put them in an inhalation chamber where they passively inhale TCE, just like a person would in a workplace where they work with TCE vapor, right? So these animals they don't know that they're being exposed to this. They don't get very sick. But when we look at their brain, they develop Parkinson's disease pathology. I apologize for the sirens behind me. I am on a medical campus. They develop Parkinson's pathology. They don't necessarily develop other neurodegenerative pathologies. Sometimes we cross into different diseases like Alzheimer's or dementia with Lewy bodies, maybe ALS, but they don't develop other things. It's Parkinson's disease. And so the fact that we can take a chemical, apply it to the entire body, and Parkinson's is the pathological outcome, I think really is important to note. That's something that we don't always talk about when we look really deeply at these mechanisms, which is what we do in the lab every day. And so these animal models are really critical. It's also how we test therapeutic strategies in order to block that from happening, or even prevention strategies. If you've been exposed to something, are there ways that we can then block these pathogenic processes from then turning into Parkinson's disease in a human? And so that's ultimately our goal in the lab, and we do this every day. And so it's just again an example for how critical these models are, and working together with someone like Sarah, who then takes these samples and looks at the genetic and epigenetic gene regulatory changes. It's just another example of how this research network is really critical in order to get this done.
That was fantastic, Sarah and Brianna. We'll get back to that in a moment. But I wanted to ask Brianna, we'll stick with you. So you mentioning TCE quite a bit. So that's not a pesticide. But what other contaminants or environmental toxins that is associated with Parkinson's that are not pesticides?
Yeah, so organic solvents like TCE are a concern. There are also studies ongoing and have been ongoing since even the 1950s to link heavy metal exposure. For example, manganese was once used in the welding industry, and that's been deeply linked to a neurodegenerative condition called manganism, which is very similar to Parkinson's disease. Manganese still is a concern for Parkinson's-like neurodegeneration. So heavy metals. Air pollution has been studied in the context of Parkinson's, where air pollution differs just a little bit from these other toxicants like certain pesticides, organic solvents, and heavy metals, is that air pollution is a risk factor for almost every disease. And so, for example, if you look at the list of diseases that the WHO is concerned about for air pollution, it's asthma, cardiovascular disease, lung cancer, things that are really, really highly associated. And Parkinson's is somewhere down that list. Like it's definitely a concern. We don't want to be exposed to air pollution for so many reasons, and Parkinson's is certainly one of them. But I think what it shows you is that these vulnerable cells in our brain, these dopaminergic neurons, they can be impacted by general toxicant exposures. And so just kind of to wrap that up, there are a lot of different things that are associated with Parkinson's risk, and it's not just any one of them. Of course, it's the interaction of these things that we are exposed to across our entire lifespan that has to do with the risk for Parkinson's disease. And so many different things that we're talking specifically about pesticides. So many different things can be linked to Parkinson's risk, and we can be exposed to them in many different ways.
Yeah, it's highly complicated as you are explaining. So we're going to get to the Q&A in a moment, but we may answer some of the Q&A in this part. So what can people actually do to reduce their risk if you're living with Parkinson's, which would be, I guess, reduce the progression, or for the general population who are concerned? Maybe we'll start with you. What can we actually do? Brianna, sorry. I'll start
sorry.
with you.
Well, I know that on an individual level, we want to try our best to keep ourselves safe, right? And as individuals, it can be very frustrating when it feels like we're sort of up against an entire world of things that we could be exposed to. We can do simple things, is that what you don't want to do is go overboard, because not everything has been proven to work. But we can do simple things like understand our local water reports, make sure we know what's in our drinking water, and if there are things of concern, should we be filtering that out? I think most people now are aware we should be filtering our water, and so making sure that you are filtering your water to the extent that is appropriate for the environment around you. If you have very contaminated water, you might want to come up with a more aggressive approach. Air filtration, I'm a huge fan of. I think reducing air pollutants in your indoor air is very critical. There are studies linking brain and cardiovascular function to minute by minute indoor air. And so, I always think that having a high quality and tested air purifier is really critical. Beyond that, of course, we should be careful about our use of pesticides. If you're a pesticide applicator, you need to be following all the appropriate PPE guidelines that are recommended. So that probably includes wearing a respirator. If you use pesticides at home, you need to follow the recommended and appropriate use for that. That might mean that you use gloves, wear a mask, and make sure that you don't, wear their clothing into your home following use of that. So there are a lot of things we could do at the individual level. Of course, it's going to take policy changes and government intervention to really get at the larger level, like banning the use of certain toxic substances that we believe are a concern. And then the other, effect would be cleaning up the environment that, again, we can't do as individuals. We need industrial sort of wide elimination of toxic sites. And so that would be another sort of government-wide initiative.
Yeah. Thank you. Sarah, any thoughts?
Yeah, that was an amazing and very comprehensive description from Brianna already. I guess I just wanted to highlight again that a lot of these risk factors, they are risk factors that it doesn't mean if you have one exposure that it causes it. And likely there are modifiable things that we are still researching and discovering that might be protective. So one that's quite generic, but I think still quite effective in different diseases, including neurodegenerative diseases, is physical activity and exercise. So staying physically healthy is neuroprotective, improves your brain function, improves your neuron health, and so therefore is a general buffer against Parkinson's or other neurodegenerative diseases as well.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point there. Mark, what are your thoughts on this? And then also, I want to also ask you for the first question, how can we advocate politically to change policy on pesticide manufacture? So first, your top tips of what you can do, and then your thoughts on advocacy.
They actually overlap, Tilo, if I may say so. Brianna and Sarah have stolen old thunder in terms of what you can do and what really matters. The obvious things, washing your vegetables, checking where they come from, being consumers in an intelligent way, and that moves me. So the PPE clothing when you deal with pesticides is really important. And we are actually too casual about that. I personally have been far too casual about it. Being a landscape architect, I thought I could happily spray glyphosate on our terrace. But of course, I didn't check properly the quantities and the proportions, etc., nor did I wear a mask, maybe. So taking that very serious on an individual level is, I think, key. But it's not going to change the use of and the power of pesticides. That can only come by organized, coordinated action and campaigning, like those inhabitants who are opposite the field of lily growing. Now, of course, that causes problems because here is someone perfectly legitimate going about his or her business, growing lilies, stopped from doing that work, earning a living, by a court direction which says there's no evidence that you don't do any harm. And there's been several court cases in the Netherlands whereby immediate prohibit use of certain pesticides has been declared by the judge or required. So there's a lot of power in that. But again, this should not be on a small individual level or local level because it creates too much of tension and unnecessary conflict between people. But if we did it on a more national scale, using agencies such as Parkinson's Net in the Netherlands, and other organizations, continuously support and bring together those measures that will help us, and the methods that we can apply to increase pressure, I think that's very important. Because increasingly, people with Parkinson's are being listened to. But listened to is only beginning of the story. We wanted to go a lot further than that, and as quickly as possible, of course.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just also wanted to mention Cure Parkinson's have supported a recent campaign for the Soil Association to ban glyphosate, this herbicide Roundup. It's mostly known as Roundup. I think the link will be sent around with the notes afterwards. So please sign the petition to advocate for reduction of these pesticides. So Mark, you mentioned, I'm going to move to Brianna next. I think you mentioned about washing fruit, something like that. And there's a question about pesticides on fruit and whether organic fruit is better. Is there any evidence that residue on fruit has increased risk of Parkinson's?
So there are not very strong evidence yet that the pesticide residues on food are tied to an statistically increased risk for Parkinson's disease. The lack of evidence does not mean lack of risk, but it is something that I have not seen really robust and rigorous literature on that yet. Something to note, organic does not mean pesticide free. There are plenty of organic pesticides that can kill neurons. In fact, one of the most toxic pesticides we use, rotenone, is an organic pesticide. And so, just because it comes from nature doesn't mean it's not dangerous. As I'm sure all of you can appreciate, there are many of dangerous things in nature, chemicals that exist. We should use an amount of caution when we try to interpret things like only buying organic. Now, everyone is entitled to assess their own risk in their own lives. And I do think that, we need to be aware. It'd be great if we knew what types of pesticides were used on what produce we have. That's not usually possible. Washing your produce is a great way to be very careful and make sure that you are minimizing your ingestion. There are different methods to wash produce. I think I saw a study a few years ago that showed that actually using running cold water was one of the best ways to get rid of pesticide residue, especially on leafy greens. If you're interested in that kind of information, a quick search online will help you find the type of produce washing that's right for you. I encourage you to look up things like that to help you determine what's best and what type of risks would be helpful. But yeah, in terms of data, we don't have a lot of data showing that like eating a lot of produce is specifically linked to that. There are a few studies out there, but the really strong aggregate data is not quite aligned with that yet.
Yeah, thank you. No, that makes sense. Yeah, inhalation and living near or maybe contaminated drinking water, the evidence is much stronger there. But still, the cautionary route is always the better route. This is a question for Sarah. What makes individuals more prone to PD than others who are exposed to the exact same environment?
Yeah, so this comes back to this interaction between the genetics and the environment that we think is taking place. Certainly, there's at least an additive effect, meaning you have a background profile of genetic risk, like probably many, many different variants, which each increase your risk just a little bit, but together they add up. And then you're also exposed to something. But on top of that, we think it's possible that they even interact. So if you have both hits, basically, it's more than just adding them up. They sort of multiply. And so it could be that individuals that are genetically more vulnerable are more likely to develop Parkinson's following an exposure. It's not entirely so. Other factors that play into it is, of course, age. So Brianna touched on this. Of course, Parkinson's is an older age disease. So typically, young adults or children do not get Parkinson's. But with the exposures here again, we don't know what that means. Likely exposures in early life are going to be relevant and are playing out over a really long time and causing and increasing those vulnerabilities. So there's so many factors interacting based on your genetic risk profile, your current physical state, your age, your sex, and different risk factors that could be playing in that likely explain why some people who are exposed develop disease while others don't.
Yeah. Can I stay with you, Sarah? I got a really interesting question about
Yeah.
women process pesticides differently, or the sex differences. And we know that there is a slight preponderance of males getting Parkinson's, but in Japan, I heard it was the opposite. And one explanation I heard is that in Japan, women do a lot of the farming.
Interesting.
Like that. So is there a sex difference in processing pesticides
So
for men and women?
this is a really interesting question. And probably one that Brianna should also say something to, but I don't think in the very basic mechanism of action of the pesticide, I don't think there would be a difference, but probably in the cellular downstream response that's happening. So one thing, for example, that's been observed, including studies that we've been involved in, is that you get neuroinflammation. So basically inflammation of the brain and the immune cells around your substantia nigra and about the neurons around the neurons that are dying. And we definitely know that immune regulation is something that varies quite strikingly between men and women, and that in some sense maybe women have slightly more active and more easily activatable immune systems. And so that could be a factor that plays into a differential response to exposure.
Brianna?
Yeah, I'll just add a few things on top of that, and Sarah's absolutely right. The difference between male and female response to neurotoxicity is a highly complex topic, and we don't know why some substances women tend to have less toxicity overall, and others it can be flipped. It kind of depends on what you're exposed to. In the neurotoxic world of pesticides, it does seem that at least female animals tend to be less likely to develop acute toxicity from exposure to these chemicals. In fact, I ran a study in my postdoc where we looked at the male and female rat response to the pesticide rotenone, and we found that female rats were significantly less vulnerable to neurotoxicity. In fact, we had to use a much higher dose in the female rats, which is really perplexing. But there could be many things going on there. What's been studied most heavily is the role of estrogen in neuroprotection. And so the idea is that estrogen can be an anti-inflammatory and protective molecule. That leads down the line of research to, are women more at risk for Parkinson's and neurodegeneration development as they enter into menopause, and is there something we can do about it? Now, that's a very, very tricky research topic and something that we don't have a lot of data on yet, but something that we are thinking about in this field. And I know that that's a question for many diseases, not just Parkinson's, but something that we're concerned about in terms of exposure.
Great. I'm going to ask about occupations now. So we have a very interesting question about firefighters. So firefighters in the UK have an increased incidence of Parkinson's. They're not sure if this is also in the US, but are certain occupations more associated with Parkinson's than others?
So occupational exposure is absolutely a risk for disease, and it's something that is tracked pretty closely. The general caveat is that occupation is not a great way to know your risk for Parkinson's. The reason why being sort of what Sarah and I have said briefly, which is that you're exposed to many things over your lifespan, and we don't always know what a person is exposed to at any given occupation. In the case of the firefighters or a group of individuals who are often exposed at higher levels to toxic chemicals, like, for example, flame retardants are heavily associated with high levels of PFAS or perfluoroalkyl substances, that can certainly become something that rises to the top in terms of risk burden. And so we do worry about people who use these chemicals in their daily lives for many years. Again, pesticide applicators would be one. Individuals who work with organic solvents, for example, would be another. And so, yeah, we do track occupational exposure, but it is very difficult to actually link the occupation with Parkinson's risk. Sometimes it comes out, sometimes it does not. It's not a very satisfying answer, but certainly something that we worry about as toxicologists.
We're going to move to a question about the gut brain axis. So this was for Brianna. You mentioned dopaminergic neurons a lot, but is the gut affected by these pesticides and pathology in the gut earlier than the dopaminergic neurons?
So the research field is still really early for understanding the specific role of gut microbiome and exposure to environmental chemicals, particularly those that we ingest. There are a couple of fields of thought on this, and they all intersect, so it makes it quite complicated. The first one being that Microbes in your gut may be more at risk for toxicity to a pesticide because they are not, mammalian cell. And so you may kill off your gut microbiome in a way that is detrimental to your health by ingesting something that has a high amount of a pesticide or another chemical that you're ingesting, perhaps in your drinking water. The other concern is that if you are inducing pathology in your gut, for example, if you are ingesting a substance that could damage enteric neurons, that does have a link to the brain. And so, can you be exposed to something that is impacting your gut health or causing gut permeability and ultimately inducing risk in the brain? There are certainly experimental studies that suggest that that could be true. We have very few of them so far, and so it's a little bit early to say for sure that that's a plausible answer. I do think that, most people who are ingesting, inhaling, or having other types of exposure may have an impact on gut microbiome. We just don't know how much of a role that's playing in overall disease risk or how to separate that from the entire systemic condition. And so, certainly a hot topic of research going on right now.
Yeah, thank you, Brianna. I'm going to ask you another question about a paper that came out in the United States about people living near golf courses. And this made the Scottish press because we have a lot of golf courses in Scotland. So I guess you've read that paper, but what do you think about people who live near golf courses and how are they exposed?
Yeah, so this is really new research that we don't have a lot of information on besides that association. And the way that the study was done was using geospatial mapping. And so individuals who lived within a certain radius of these golf courses were assayed for Parkinson's risk. And, the idea, I think, is that these pesticides that are applied at relatively higher levels on these golf courses are then getting into the drinking water supply and potentially in the air of people who live near them. And so it's in line with this idea that chronic exposure, so 20, 30 years of exposure to something, could increase your risk for a disease that happens later in life. And so it may take a very long time of exposure in order to resolve a neurodegenerative condition. Again, it's just one association study, so we don't know yet how much that risk can be replicated across different golf courses, different pesticides being applied. I think it's a cautionary tale that we need to be using data like this to try to understand what our risk is and how we can impact that by changing our environment. So something to be cautious about, but the jury's still out a little bit on what that risk is going to be.
Yeah, great. We'll keep a close eye on that. Sarah, I'm going to come back to you because the epigenetic question was quite broken up. So again, are there differences between people with PD and without PD in the epigenetic area, and do pesticides influence that?
Yes, we think there are, although we're in the early days because these assays and these types of approaches are relatively recently developed, and it's quite challenging to study this in human brain samples. So we work with brains donated to brain banks, and to actually look at what individual cells are doing in the context of Parkinson's and in the animal models in the context of exposures to specific pesticide. But even in this early stage pilot data, we do see some things that seem to be consistent between what's happening in a pesticide exposed rat brain and in a idiopathic Parkinson's brain, so one that doesn't have one of those monogenic genetic mutations that causes Parkinson's. And some of those things include upregulation of inflammation. And here the epigenetic regulators may be driving some of the harmful inflammatory response as well. So that's particularly why we're interested in it, because it might tell us some of the molecular switches that we could target to maybe reverse those responses and to maybe push cells into more helpful or protective states.
Mark, I'm going to ask you a very difficult question about the impact of pesticides on biodiversity. This is someone who works in bird conservation, but the person is asking, could we get some cross-sector advocacy about the effect of pesticides on biodiversity, but also on humans in terms of Parkinson's? Have you ever thought of this? This is a really interesting idea.
This is a huge area of work, but also of attention. I think it is not gone unnoticed that more and more of us are talking about working with nature rather than working against nature. And this applies both in terms of the fight against Parkinson's, asking the obvious questions about healthy living, healthy environment, etc., as well as in the environment, the wider environment. Again, referring to the Netherlands, there is hardly any country so hugely modified by us people in the way we force it to be. In fact, some people have already designed the protective seawalls to keep Amsterdam dry, even if sea level rise by a meter. Hypothetically, but it signifies the type of thinking. We must break that down, because creating healthy environments, creating rich environments, repairing the huge damage against biodiversity. You all have heard David Attenborough saying that 50% of species has been lost in the UK in the last 5 or 10 years. That is huge. So unless we arrest that, I think we have even less opportunity and chance to deal with issues such as Parkinson's. Because we will all be very hard hit by the economic consequences of not working with nature and biodiversity. And associated with that, of course, the personal and the family and friends implications of having illnesses such as Parkinson, multiple sclerosis, motor neuron disease, and many cancers, etc. So I think it's a huge question. It's a huge issue, and it must be addressed in relationship with nature, working with nature.
Thank you. That's very beautifully said. Yeah, a holistic approach to solving this problem will sort of help biodiversity, will help humans, will just be good all around. Brianna, I'm going to pick up on something you said about your animal models and testing the inhalation, but you also mentioned you were testing therapeutics with your animal models. Can you give us a little bit more on therapeutics?
Yeah, so we have used a number of different therapeutic strategies in our animal models to block toxicant-induced neurodegeneration. We've spanned the entire sort of line of therapeutic options from small molecule therapeutics all the way over to gene therapy using viral vectors to insert genetic expression of proteins in order to try and assess whether that could be protective. Some of the studies that we're focused on now are actually using immunotherapies to try to modulate the immune system's response. We see a lot of immune infiltration into the brain when animals are exposed in our lab. And we think that that could be a potential way that we can block some of the progression of these induced toxic effects. And so knowing that a person who is exposed to something perhaps decades earlier cannot have some of these initial effects be mitigated at that point, maybe we can modulate the progression effects by impacting the immune system. And so those are some of the ways that we're trying to understand that in my lab right now. And just as a note, these are, again, they are toxicant models, but they also model idiopathic PD. And so what we hope with our research is that what works in our models of toxicant exposure will actually work for any individual with Parkinson's disease, right? So you don't have to have a genetic risk for Parkinson's to be treated with the therapeutic strategies that we use in the lab. And so that's kind of our hope. We apply this broadly to Parkinson's disease, not just somebody who was exposed to TCE, for example. So that's what we're working on now.
Sarah, I'm going to ask you a question about acute exposure or very high dose exposure, but for a short amount of time versus long years of exposure, low dose. Do you think acute exposures could give you high risk of Parkinson's?
So this is a good question. I mean, Probably yes, because some of the more striking epidemiological evidence, I mean, they're also not often acute, but they're very high dose exposures. So they come from the farm workers. They come from things like groundwater spillages of, for example, the solvent trichloroethylene that Brianna works on. And I think those are exposures that are grades high, much higher than the average population would be exposed to. So I definitely think there's something about high exposures having an effect. Acute exposures, yes, what we see in the animal models probably would suggest that if they're high, that they are problematic, but how that manifests, how common that is in humans, and how that would manifest long term into Parkinson's, I don't think we have definitive data on that.
Yeah. Excellent. Brianna, I'm sure you have some thoughts on acute versus chronic.
Yeah, so I mean, the quote we use in toxicology is the dose makes the poison, right? And so a high dose of a toxic exposure can have a different physiologic effect than a low dose chronic exposure. And, that could be the reason why there are numbers of different diseases associated with toxic exposures. And so someone may ask the question, why did I develop cancer from exposure to something or believed exposure to something, and why did my neighbor develop Parkinson's disease? And the answer can be a number of things. It can be dose, it can be the amount of time someone was exposed, and it can be the combination of genetics as well as other environmental exposures that were ongoing at that time. And so classic toxicological principle, but really important to note that these are something, these are things that we think about in terms of understanding risk for chronic exposures that we think are more associated with Parkinson's risk. And great answer by Sarah. Good. You're an honorary toxicologist today.
Fantastic, fantastic. No, it's been amazing, amazing answers and discussion. We're almost at the end of the session. I've been taking notes as we've been going along, and I'm going to sort of synthesize what I think I learned today, which has been really, really, really informative. So, as Brianna mentioned, there's evidence been piling up since the 1980s that pesticide applicators or people living near farms that use pesticides have an increased risk of Parkinson's. But as Sarah explained, there's many other risk factors that are involved, and some of them are genetic risk factors that can combine with the pesticides, or even combination of pesticides that will eventually could lead to Parkinson's, as we've heard from Mark's personal story. Inhalation seems to be a bit more I guess, a route to this risk more so than ingestion, but ingestion does seem to also play a role, such as in groundwater. The evidence for pesticide residue on fruit isn't strong, but it's always good to be cautious and to look up ways to wash your fruit as best as possible. There are some occupational hazards, of course. Pesticide applicator, people who have that job certainly have an increased risk. People that work with solvents. TCE has been used in a number of different industries. I know my friend Isaac is on the call. He works in the airline refueling industry that may have an increased risk of Parkinson's. So some pesticides do have, some occupations do have an increased risk. Whether men or women have a difference in processing pesticides, it may not be possible, Sarah mentioned that may not be a lot of evidence around that, but I was interested to hear that Brianna needed to use higher levels of pesticides to induce Parkinson's phenotypes in her animal models. And just moving to animal models, I think animal models have been telling us a lot of information that using certain different types of pesticides or solvents, exposing an animal, they don't get other conditions such as ALS or stuff, but they get Parkinson's. And this could be why there's an increasing risk globally, that these chemicals, when exposed to an entire animal, they get a Parkinson's pathology, which is very striking, which I hadn't actually thought about until today. What can you do? So advocacy, we need to advocate. We need to get governments to ban a lot of these pesticides. So I heard that Vermont is the first state in the US to ban paraquat, and hopefully other states will follow. So sign the petition that Cure Parkinson sends around soon. Personal things you could do if you can filter your water, and if you're in a bad water area, filter your air. I really like that Sarah mentioned exercise, so buffering yourself against these stresses is a good thing to do. Diet, of course, taking care of your diet is also a very good thing to do. But there are things that can be done now to protect yourself from some of these risks. But I think advocacy is probably the strongest thing. So we all need to work together to advocate. And that's it for now. And we hope to see you at the next webinar. Thank you very much and goodbye.